Tobias Hartwell was no hero. He was just a simple ranch hand living in the arid lands of the Wild West, where kindness was often seen as a weakness, and humanity was a luxury. But on that fateful afternoon, he did something unusual. A small act, so simple it seemed meaningless, that contained a courage that would have made anyone bow their heads in respect. He gave water to a dying man, whom he should have left alone to keep himself safe. Blood trailed from the forest to Tobias's well. It was a familiar sight to a man who had spent 37 years in the wilderness. But when he discovered that the wounded man was not a wild animal, not a bandit, but a young Indian warrior, all his survival instincts kicked in. This was 1847. Helping a native, even with a sip of water, could get him accused of treason, even killed, and everyone knew that kindness to the enemy had no place in this harsh land. But Tobias did not shoot. Beneath the blood and ragged breathing, the young man's eyes held no hatred or violence. They held a primal thirst, thirst for life, thirst for water, thirst for someone to see him as a human being. Tobias had lived through the drought of 1844, struggling for 3 days without a drop of water. He understood that feeling better than anyone, and in that moment of confrontation, he no longer saw an enemy, but only saw a man fighting death. Overcoming all prejudice, Tobias knelt, drew water from the well, and raised it to the native's lips. No hesitation, no bargaining, no second thoughts, simply doing the right thing, the thing no one else dared to do. No one ordered him to do it. No reward was promised, but that was what made the act greater than any capture or feat. In a land where violence is revered and suspicion is the unwritten law, Tobias's actions are a testament to the courage of kindness. He didn't need to take up arms to become a man of honor. A bucket of water, a non-judgmental look, and a decision to put humanity above fear. All it took was a man of honor to call Tobias Hartwell a man of honor. The wind had gone still. Not a bird stirred. Even the dry grass near the well seemed to hold its breath. Tobias Hartwell stood rigid, hand still hovering near the butt of his rifle, when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one, not two, half a dozen, fast and heavy, thundering across the rocky ridge just north of his barn. He didn't need to see them to know who it was. Marshal Dixon Webb and his men. They weren't the kind who showed up for neighborly visits. Just minutes earlier, Tobias had knelt beside a wounded Apache warrior, his hands trembling as he offered a wooden bucket full of cool water from his well. The young man had gulped down 3 full buckets, each swallow a desperate grasp at life. And now, that act of compassion, that one moment of human decency, might get him killed. Webb was known across 5 counties, a lawman by title but a stone by nature, cold, calculating, and trigger-happy when it came to Indian blood, the kind of man who'd hang you for harboring a fugitive and call it justice. And he was getting closer. Tobias wiped the sweat from his brow, though the evening air had turned crisp. He looked down at the Apache warrior slumped beside the well, blood seeping through his shirt. The man couldn't move, couldn't hide, and if Webb saw him, God help them both. Then he heard the snort of a horse just 30 feet away. "Afternoon, Hartwell," came a voice, smooth as old whiskey, but sharp enough to cut bone. Tobias turned slowly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Marshal." Simba. Webb sat tall on his black gelding, pale blue eyes sweeping the ranch like searchlights. His 5 deputies formed a half circle behind him, hands resting loosely, too loosely, on their sidearms. "We're tracking a wounded Apache," Webb said, tone lazy but laced with threat. "Blood trail leads straight to your land." Tobias kept his expression blank. Ain't seen no Indians, Marshal. Been fixing the south fence all day. Webb dismounted, boots crunching on gravel as he walked slowly toward the well. That's so. He stopped, just 10 feet away, eyeing the dark stains in the dirt. Funny, that sure looks like fresh blood to me. And unless you've been butchering cattle by your drinking water, I'd say someone's been bleeding here real recent. Behind the stone wall of the well, the Apache didn't move. Not a breath, not a whisper. But Tobias could feel the tension radiating off him, like a steel spring stretched too far. Webb's fingers brushed the grip of his coat. You know what the penalty is for harboring an Indian fugitive, Hartwell. Same as treason, rope around the neck, no trial, no mercy. Every instinct in Tobias screamed to lie, to run, to fight, but he did none of those things. Instead, he stood his ground, just a simple rancher with a heavy secret and 6 loaded guns pointed at his life. The seconds ticked by like thunderheads on the horizon. Something was about to break, and Tobias knew, in his gut, it would be loud. The moment came like a crack of lightning, fast, brilliant, and impossible to ignore. Tobias Hartwell had spent over a decade out here on the frontier, a man of the land, hardened by droughts, wildfires, and long winters. He thought he'd seen it all, but nothing. Not wild mustangs stampeding at full gallop, not prairie storms that split the sky open had prepared him for the truth that came spilling from the lips of the wounded Apache beside his well. The warrior, still propped against the stone wall, suddenly spoke, not in English at first, but in a fluid melodic string of Apache words. It wasn't weak or broken, like you'd expect from a man losing blood fast. It was clear, sharp, commanding. And it stopped Marshal Webb mid-stride like he'd just been hit with a sledgehammer. The color drained from Webb's face in an instant. His hand dropped from his pistol like it weighed 50 pounds. He stared at the young man with a look Tobias had never seen on the lawman's face before. Not anger, not disdain, but pure, unfiltered fear. And then Webb whispered it, barely audible over the breeze. Dear God. You're him. Tobias blinked. Him who? The Apache warrior turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the rancher who had risked everything to help him. Ayana, he said. Son of Chief Takakota, the one who signed the peace treaty with Fort Richardson. Tobias stepped back as the full weight of those words hit him like a bucking bronco. Ayana, he wasn't just any Apache, he was the Apache. The one people whispered about in saloons across the territory. The man who had walked, unarmed, into a room full of generals and negotiated a treaty that had stopped 3 bloody years of war between settlers and the northern Apache tribes. The man who had saved hundreds of lives on both sides, and Tobias had nearly shot him dead by a water well. It was almost too much to take in. Standing in the dirt, watching Webb's men lower their weapons in stunned disbelief, Tobias felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't just a wounded fugitive anymore. This was history bleeding out in his backyard. Ayana's voice, though strained, carried authority like few men Tobias had ever heard. There was supposed to be a meeting, he said, 3 days ago, with Colonel Morrison. We were to expand the treaty to include the southern territories. Webb's jaw clenched, but his voice cracked when he answered. Colonel Morrison is dead. Shot in the back during an Indian ambush. Ayana nodded grimly. That's what they want you to believe. But Morrison wasn't killed by Apache warriors. He was murdered by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough of our language to fool the witnesses. Tobias felt the air get heavier. He could almost hear the pieces sliding into place. Someone had wanted that treaty destroyed. Someone had staged the whole thing to make it look like the Apache had broken the peace. Ayana's gaze didn't waver. The same men who've been selling rifles to rogue tribes. The same men who profit from fear and war. They framed me because I knew too much. The sheer audacity of it took Tobias's breath away. It was treason. Betrayal on a scale few dared imagine. And somehow, through a twist of fate and a single act of mercy, he was standing at the heart of it. Webb stumbled back half a step. His bravado was slipping fast. One of his deputies, a younger man named Bradley, looked like he'd just been hit with a 2x4 of truth. "If that's true," the deputy murmured, "then we've been chasing the wrong man." Tobias couldn't stop staring at Ayana. The man was pale, soaked in blood and barely breathing, but he spoke with the quiet dignity of a born leader. There was something magnetic about him, something that made even hardened gunslingers stop and listen. He didn't plead. He didn't beg. He simply told the truth and let the truth do the work. In that moment, Tobias felt a surge of awe unlike anything he'd known before. Not the kind of awe a man feels watching lightning strike a canyon or hearing a wolf howl at midnight, but the awe of witnessing courage under impossible odds. Ayana wasn't just a symbol of peace. He was the living embodiment of it. And Tobias realized that by lowering his rifle and giving this man water, he hadn't just saved a life. He may have just saved the treaty, saved the territory, and maybe, just maybe, help history find its better path. The wind had shifted. It was subtle, just a change in the way the air moved through the dry cottonwoods. But to Tobias Hartwell, it felt like the entire world had tilted. He stood still beside the well, sweat cooling on the back of his neck, while Ayana, the wounded Apache warrior, pulled a folded blood-stained piece of paper from a pouch at his belt. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion and pain. "This," Ayana said, voice ragged but firm, "is why they want me dead." The paper, no bigger than a half-sheet of ledger stock, was handed to Marshal Webb, who took it like he was holding a snake. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 3 nights prior, signed Colonel James Morrison, the same Colonel Morrison who was now dead. As Webb scanned the page, his face changed color, shifting from dusty red to a sickly, ashen gray. His lips moved, reading silently, but his eyes, those cold blue eyes, looked shaken for the first time. "What does it say?" asked one of his deputies. Bradley, the youngest, probably no more than 25. The boy had that brittle energy of someone caught between loyalty and conscience. "They interlocked it, it says," Ayana answered. That Colonel Morrison had discovered the names of men selling weapons to the renegade bands, men who staged the ambush that killed him, men who wanted the peace treaty to fail. Webb didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence said it all. But Ayana wasn't finished. His next words cut through the warm evening air like a blade. It also says someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes, covering the shipments, looking the other way. A stunned hush fell over the range yard. No one moved. No one breathed. Tobias glanced at the deputies surrounding Webb. For the first time, they weren't looking at Ayana. They were looking at their boss. And what they saw in his face was more damning than anything written in ink. Bradley shifted in his saddle. "Marshal, is that true?" Webb didn't answer. He didn't look up. The letter in his hand now felt radioactive. Tobias's gut twisted. He'd always distrusted the lawmen who came through this part of the country with too much swagger and too little patience. But even he hadn't imagined the rot ran this deep. He looked at the deputies again, 5 men in dusty coats, hands resting near their holsters. For years they had followed orders, raided camps, hauled people in chains, killed when told to. Now they stood on sacred ground, a ranch, a well, and a moment of reckoning. You could see it in their faces, the beginning of guilt. The slow, painful realization that they'd been part of something much uglier than law and order. "I remember," Bradley said quietly, 3 months ago, that shipment of rifles we were told got stolen, the one they blamed on the Apache." A nod from another deputy. "I saw one of those rifles," Bradley continued, 2 weeks later, "in the hands of a white settler riding south. I didn't say anything at the time, figured I'd imagined it." He looked at Webb now, eyes wide with something between betrayal and shame. "But maybe I didn't." Tobias felt a pang deep in his chest. It was the sound of men waking up too late, like watching someone step onto thin ice only after hearing the first crack. They'd all believed this story. Indians were raiders, savages, killers. That was the line, simple and clean. It gave them permission to pull the trigger, to look the other way. But now, the story was broken. Now they saw what they'd never wanted to see. And guilt is a cruel teacher. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It worms its way into your bones and makes you replay every command you followed, every man you ignored, every lie you helped enforce. Ayana didn't accuse them. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any sermon. And Tobias saw it, that hollow look in the deputy's eyes, like men remembering the day they became tools instead of protectors. The line between good and evil hadn't moved. They had, and now they stood, guns at their sides, no longer sure who the enemy was. Maybe it wasn't the man with the war paint. Maybe it was the one who had given them orders. And maybe, just maybe, it was the part of themselves that had followed without question. The air had grown heavier by the minute. Somewhere beyond the ridge thunder rumbled, not from the sky, but from dozens of hooves pounding the hard earth. Tobias Hartwell could feel it in his bones before he heard it with his ears. A sound like a storm approaching. Not weather, not wind. Riders. Many of them. Ayana had stopped speaking minutes ago, but his voice still echoed in Tobias's mind. Words about betrayal, corruption, war profiteers, and a peace treaty hanging by a thread. The wounded Apache leaned against the well, face pale, breathing ragged. His blood had soaked into the dirt around Tobias's boots. Across the yard, Marshal Webb's pistol was still drawn, pointed now squarely at Tobias's chest. "You helped him," Webb said, voice flat but trembling with rage. "You signaled them. You brought this on us." "I gave him water," Tobias replied quietly, "same as I'd do for any dying man." The look Webb gave him in return was one of disbelief. Not at the act of mercy itself, but at Tobias's willingness to stand by it, even now, when the consequences were coming fast and hard over the hill. The hoofbeats grew louder. Tobias counted instinctively. 10, 15, no, at least 50 riders. Webb's fingers twitched on the pistol grip. "They're coming for blood," he muttered, "and you gave them the invitation." But Tobias saw something else in Ayana's face as the dust rose beyond the ridge. Not fear, not vengeance, resolve. Moments later, they crested the horizon. 50 Apache warriors on horseback, their formation precise, their silhouettes sharp against the amber sky. Not a single one of them broke ranks. No one shouted, no war cries, just purposeful silence. And at the head of the formation rode an elder, his gray braids tied with eagle feathers, his face carved by time and memory. He sat his horse like a king, back straight, eyes locked on the scene below. It didn't take long to realize who he was. Chief Takakota, Ayana's father. Tobias had never seen such presence in a man. It wasn't arrogance, it was gravity, the kind of stillness that pulled the truth out of people. The Apache riders didn't come with rifles raised. They didn't encircle the ranch like a war party. Instead, they formed a wide, respectful perimeter, as if guarding a sacred place. That's when the tide turned. Deputy Bradley stepped forward, holding out a sealed document. "This came from the Territorial Governor's office this morning," he said. "All pursuit of Ayana is suspended pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb didn't believe it, couldn't. He reached for his sidearm again, but this time it was Tobias who acted first. The rancher tackled the marshal to the ground with the full weight of 185 pounds crashing down like a sack of feed. The pistol went flying. Webb knocked breathless. Dirt kicked up around them as the two struggled. When it was over, Webb lay face down in the dust, wrists pinned behind him by two of his own deputies. His loyal companion Hawkins didn't even try to intervene. He just stood frozen, realizing his world had come undone. Silence fell again. Thick, tense. It was then something extraordinary happened. Chief Takakota dismounted, walked forward with deliberate grace, and knelt beside his son. He said nothing at first, just pressed a hand gently against Ayana's wound, then rested his forehead against his son's. Tobias looked away. The moment was too personal, too intimate. But when the chief stood, he turned to Tobias. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with something far deeper. Respect. He placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache. Ayana, despite the pain, translated with a quiet reverence. "He says you are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy, risking your life for truth. These are the actions of a true warrior." Tobias couldn't speak. His throat tightened and his eyes burned. All he had done was give a dying man a drink of water. But that act, simple, human, unremarkable in any other time or place, had changed the course of history. He hadn't planned to stand between a corrupt lawman and justice. He hadn't meant to become the bridge between two worlds. But now, standing in the dirt of his own ranch, surrounded by warriors who should have seen him as an enemy, he felt something he'd never felt before. Seen, understood, accepted, and above all else, grateful. He was grateful he hadn't pulled the trigger, grateful he'd listened to his conscience, not the voices of fear. Grateful he'd chosen to see a man, not a threat. Because sometimes what saves the world isn't power or politics. Sometimes it's just a cup of water and the courage to care. As the sun dipped low behind the western hills, the sky turned to fire. Ribbons of gold, crimson, and burnt orange streaking across the horizon like some divine canvas. But Tobias Hartwell wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at something far more profound. The circle of Apache warriors had dismounted, quietly, respectfully. One by one, they approached Tobias where he stood near the well. no weapons in hand, no aggression in their eyes. Just calm, purposeful movement. And one by one, they reached out and touched his hand. Not a handshake, not a salute, but a gesture deeper than custom. A recognition of kinship. Tobias had never been part of a tribe. He'd grown up on the edge of society, white by skin, but always something of an outsider. His neighbors saw him as a recluse, a man more comfortable with horses than with people. But in that moment, surrounded by men who had every reason to hate him, he was being accepted, not as a stranger, not as an exception, but as a brother. Chief Takakota stood before him again, this time holding something long and wrapped in deerskin. When he pulled the cloth away, Tobias's breath caught in his throat. It was a war lance nearly 6 feet in length, carved with symbols Tobias didn't recognize but instinctively respected. Eagle feathers hung from its shaft, beadwork wrapped in tight, intricate patterns near the grip. It radiated history, not just as a weapon, but as a sacred heirloom. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief said in perfect English, "and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache. Until today." Tobias didn't know what to say. He took the lance with both hands, his fingers trembling under the weight, not of the object itself, but what it meant. He wasn't just being thanked. He was being honored. Beside him, Ayana, now treated and stabilized by the tribal medicine man, watched silently, his face calm despite the exhaustion. When Tobias met his gaze, the younger man gave a slight nod. No words. Just understanding. "You didn't just save my life," Ayana said quietly. "You saved the treaty. You gave hope a chance to breathe again." "I just gave a man water," Tobias replied. Ayana smiled, the same way he had back at the well, not with triumph, but with deep gratitude. "Sometimes," he said, "that's how the world changes." By morning, they were gone. The Apache riders slipped away at first light, silent as fog, carrying with them their leader, their son, and the precious letter that would soon tear open a scandal in the territorial government. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The weapons operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty, once fragile as a thread, was not only reaffirmed but expanded to include every tribe in the territory. But the papers didn't talk about that day at Tobias Hartwell's ranch. They didn't mention the water well, the blood in the dirt, or the war lance now hanging above Tobias' fireplace, like a sacred promise. They didn't know what it meant to be told in a language older than the nation itself that you are now family. Because some truths aren't printed, they're lived. And sometimes, in the brutal, unforgiving world of the American frontier, the most powerful act isn't to fight, but to understand, not to dominate, but to connect. And in doing so, a lone rancher with nothing to gain and everything to lose became the first white man in territorial history to be adopted into the Apache Nation. Not for heroism, not for glory, but for doing what was right and what was sacred.